Please welcome President Lee C. Bollinger and President of COP26, Alok Sharma.
I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone to this World Leaders Forum event. We are very pleased to have as our honored guest Alok Sharma, President of COP26, who will speak about his experience forging the historic Glasgow Climate Pact last year. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize our co-sponsors, the Center on Global Economic Governance and the Columbia Climate School. When I became president of Columbia 2 decades ago, the World Leaders Forum was one of the first initiatives we launched. The goal was to create a university-wide event series that welcomed heads of state and government and other influential people to speak about the most pressing issues of the moment, with the understanding that they must be willing to answer questions directly from our students. Over the years, we've had many very memorable guests, more than 150. Shinzo Abe, Madeleine Albright, Kofi Annan, Jacinda Ardern, Michelle Bachelet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Antonio Guterres, Sana Marin, and the list goes on and on. This week, in addition to our guests from the United Nations, we have welcomed leaders from the European Commission, Belarus, North Macedonia, and later today we will hear from the President of Chile. I am enormously proud of what we have achieved with this event series. I am also incredibly grateful for all that I and we have learned from our guests and from the students and faculty who have questioned and debated them. The World Leaders Forum has been part of a broader effort at Columbia over the past decades to be more international in our outlook and our physical presence, and to find ways to be more engaged with the major challenges facing our global society, something we call the fourth purpose of the university, in addition to scholarship, teaching, and public service. Of course, there is no issue, no matter of more consequence or in greater need of fundamental research, teaching, and action by all institutions, universities especially, than the crisis of climate. At Columbia, we have had some of the best scientists and researchers in the world at the forefront of academic discovery in climate science. In 2020, we announced the creation of the Columbia Climate School to centralize, expand, and elevate our efforts. It was the first new school to be established at Columbia in 25 years, and the first of its kind in the United States. Just last month, the school welcomed its second class of master's students, and it is currently the university partner for Climate Week, New York City. We are all very much looking forward to seeing how the school and its faculty and students progress in the years and decades ahead. With that, it is my great pleasure to introduce the school's founding dean, Alex Halliday, who will be our next speaker. Alex is a celebrated geochemist who came here in 2018 from the University of Oxford, where he led the Science and Engineering Division, among other many distinctions. He will be introducing President Sharma and moderating the discussion. Please join me in welcoming now. Alex.
Good morning and welcome to you all. Got blazing sunshine coming in. Being asked to participate in a World Leaders Forum as a moderator is always an honor, but this one is especially important and significant to me. Many of you here today will be familiar with COP26, the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, which was held in Glasgow last November. COP, for those of you who haven't been to one, is an amazing event bringing together representatives from around the world, and COP26 was the first COP for the brand new Columbia Climate Score. Our speaker today, Alok Sharma, is the president for COP26 and a minister of the Cabinet Office in the UK government. At COP26, he negotiated the Glasgow Climate Pact. He is a member of Parliament for Reading, and you may think this may be a coincidence, but Reading is a city which hosts the world-leading European Centre for Medium-Range Weather Forecasting, which correctly predicted the path of Superstorm Sandy, which hit New York in 2012. Secretary of State for he was previously Secretary of State for International Development and Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. He joins us today to share his experiences with negotiating and then implementing the pact, as well as the roles young people can play in delivering the ambition and action that we need to address the climate crisis. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you the Right Honourable Alok Sharma.
Good morning, everyone. And could I first start by thanking President Bollinger and Alex for the very warm welcome that I've had today. So I'm now into the final weeks of my time as the president of the 26th United Nations Conference on Climate Change, or as you've heard, COP26 for short. And for me, it's been a near 3-year journey in the thick of international climate politics and also the maelstrom of wider geopolitics. And it remains an absolute privilege to have opportunities like this one, to speak as part of your World Leaders Forum, and also to celebrate Columbia's pioneering climate school, the first of its kind in the United States. I know your school has had an auspicious start, not least with your round table at COP26 with President Obama. And I understand that the former president, and of course Columbia alumnus, noted the energy and remarkable potential of participating students. And that, of course, is coming from a man who knows what it means to mobilize and to inspire. Now, I felt that same boundless energy, that potential, and that drive when I've met youth climate activists around the world over the past few years. And I have to say this to you, I do understand the anger of young people. Ultimately, it is your future which is most at risk. You and your generation will have to live with the consequences of the actions, or in some cases, the inaction of current world leaders. Look, I've been directly challenged a number of times by young people on the need to push the world to go a lot faster to tackle global warming. And I convened an international meeting for ministers on implementing the Glasgow Climate Pact in May in Copenhagen. And we saw youth protesters making their feelings and frustrations plain. Every minister saw that as they came into the meeting. And at the end of the meeting, I encouraged those ministers to leave with the voices of those young people ringing in their ears and hearing those voices every time that they made government decisions affecting the future of the planet. And so that brings me to the focus of my address. You all know this, but it sometimes needs to be repeated. We are facing a climate crisis. The scientific evidence is absolutely clear, it's unequivocal. And we know that we are running out of time to avert catastrophe. The reality is that if we do not bend the curve of global warming downwards in this decisive decade, 8.5 years left, We will go beyond the limits of our ability to adapt. And around the world, we are already seeing what that future could look like. And that future is absolutely terrifying. And for some people across the world, it is here, right now. You'll have seen that in recent weeks, an area the size of the United Kingdom has been flooded in Pakistan. A monster monsoon bringing in its wake death, destruction, and displacement of millions of people. Hurricane Fiona has barreled through the Caribbean. This summer, we have seen the US experience its worst drought in over 1,000 years. In Europe, we've experienced the worst drought in 500 years. And China, its worst ever drought, as record temperatures have dried up key parts of the Yangtze River. Now, look, I could go on. You will all have examples as well. And I was with the new UNFCCC Executive Secretary Simon Steele earlier this week, and we had a discussion. And he made the point that the reality of these events is a cycle of disaster, rebuild, disaster, rebuild, disaster, rebuild. And that's the case for millions of people around the world. We need to do better. And we also know that the increasing frequency and ferocity of these extreme weather events is set to worsen. So in the context of the pressing need for more urgent climate action, I want to talk to you a little bit today about my role, the COP presidency, and of course then our drive to implement the outcomes of the Glasgow Climate Pact, and the ability of global coalitions of the willing, including, very importantly, the United States, to deliver change. And most importantly, the capacity of young climate leaders in this room this morning, you, to hold governments and businesses to account. Now, the primary role of the COP president is to oversee a COP summit, deliver a negotiated outcome, and then drive its implementation in the post-summit presidency year. I'm really proud, actually, that when the world came to Glasgow last November, the UK presidency, and I've got some of my team here who were central to this, shepherded nearly 200 countries to forge the historic Glasgow Climate Pact. But I have to say to you that the outcome of that pact was not inevitable. There was actually huge skepticism in the international community at the start of the UK's presidency designate about whether we really could make progress on the road to and at Glasgow. And personally, COP26 was my first COP. I'd never been to one before. And it was because of that, very early on, I went around and sought the advice of past COP presidents. And from my very first day as COP president designate, I sought to meet world leaders, to meet ministers, to meet chief executives, to meet civil society, youth groups, and also really importantly, communities on the front line of climate change around the world. And for me and my team, this was all about ensuring an open and neutral presidency, underpinned by the principles of transparency, of inclusivity, of a consistency of message, and trust. And trust, I have to say to you, is an incredibly fragile commodity in climate negotiations. And what I want to do was to ensure that those four principles would be the foundation on which we built an ambitious COP26 outcome. But having worked and spent 2 years talking to governments around the world, trying to craft what would emerge as the key elements of the Glasgow Climate Pact, we almost fell short in the final hours of COP26. We had an opacity in those 1 minute to midnight negotiations. China and India raised objections to key language on coal and fossil fuel subsidies. So we went behind the stage to negotiate. And as we negotiated, I wrote out, word by word, the minimum changes which India and China would accept. And I can tell you, it was pretty fraught. And I still have at home the marked up A4 paper on which we wrote out the text. And for me, that is an eternal reminder that things could actually have turned out very, very differently. Because there were absolutely critical moments in those final hours when I was actually very concerned that a global deal, effectively 2 years in gestation, was about to collapse. And I think for any of you who are watching this on television, you'll have seen that I and members of my team were crossing the plenary floor. I was showing the proposed revised text to the chairs of the UNFCCC negotiating groups. And, you know, I did become a bit emotional when I put the final text to the floor. And the reason for that is that I was actually disappointed that after having run such a transparent presidency, the COP26 negotiating process was ending in hushed and rushed conversations. But I can also say to you that I was, and I continue actually to be incredibly proud of what my UK COP presidency team achieved in delivering the Glasgow Climate Pact. And our overall goal, right from the start, was to garner enough commitments to ensure that we were keeping alive the prospect of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And we achieved that goal. If you think back, prior to the Paris Agreement, the scientists were telling us that the world was on course for 4 degrees of global warming by the end of the century. Post-Paris, the consensus view was 3 degrees. After Glasgow, we were able to say, with credibility, that we had kept 1.5 degrees alive. And of course, whilst 1.5 degrees was our lodestar, we did make critical progress on adaptation, on finance, on loss and damage, on empowerment, and so many other issues. In fact, the chair of the Climate Vulnerables Forum, a grouping of some of the most vulnerable countries to climate change around the world, recognized the steps we'd taken on all the priorities of the most climate-threatened nations. Now, I have to say this to you. Yes, we achieved a pact. But frankly, the pact is nothing but words on a page. And the pulse of 1.5 degrees will remain weak until the pact and every element of it is implemented in full. And, you know, we have to be frank. The implementation is really very challenging. Firstly, we all signed up to an ambitious program of work. And second, the world has changed markedly since November, overshadowed by the Putin regime's brutal and illegal war in Ukraine. Countries around the world are facing perilous economic and geopolitical conditions, threats to energy security. We're grappling with soaring inflation, rising debt, food insecurity. And so for many, climate has not been front of mind. But having said that, I do believe this very truly, that there remains cause for hope. And I do see climate leaders doing remarkable work. Take, for example, the Prime Minister of Vietnam, who I saw again last month. He is utterly relentless in driving his country's economic transformation based on clean energy. And so we, as a G7 and other developed nations, are supporting that effort with Vietnam's Just Energy Transition Partnership, which can be the gold standard for sustainable economic development and growth for developing countries around the world. Businesses and financial institutions are radically reimagining what it means to be a responsible 21st century company. Bill Gates, who I spent some time with earlier this week, rightly noted that COP26 was a COP where businesses came in force. And you'll all have just seen in the last week the founder of Patagonia dedicating his company's fortune to the climate cause. Now, where are we in this process? Well, we're going to get a clearer sense of that when the UNFCCC publishes its latest synthesis report. And the deadline for countries to make submissions on their 2030 emission reduction targets is tomorrow. Now, I have to say to you that I'm quite sure that when that report will come out, it will also make clear that the job is far from done. I was in Indonesia earlier this month at the G20 Climate, Energy and Environment Ministers meeting. And unbelievably, our negotiators had to fight to simply reinstate commitments that we have all previously signed up to. Inexplicably, there were debates about the unequivocal science of the IPCC reports. Some countries sought to push against language from the Glasgow Climate Pact, agreed just 10 months ago, and also the foundational Paris Agreement on which that pact is built. And there was even rowing back from the collective agreement that was reached by G20 leaders last year to lead on climate action. So my message here in New York this week has actually been pretty frank. The Glasgow and Paris language must be the baseline of our ambition. We cannot retreat from that. And this, for me, is a critical moment to redouble our efforts to resist backsliding and ultimately go further and faster. It's also worth pointing out that collectively, the world's richest countries and the biggest emitters have looked too many climate-vulnerable countries and communities in the eye and promised so much action to step back now. To do so would be a betrayal. And of course, the United States is a key player in all of these discussions. It's the second biggest emitter in the world, it's the largest by capita, and the US therefore has a responsibility to lead on climate action. And in my travels as COP president, and all my time speaking with the world's most vulnerable communities and countries, that is a firmly held view. They want to continue to see the US leading. But we also know that thankfully the US has unparalleled resources and expertise. And that was actually pretty evident as we all watched with a mixture of hope and trepidation the machinations surrounding the Build Back Better bill and the ultimate passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate spending package in US history. And I want to congratulate President Biden and my very good friend John Kerry for their roles in securing that historic achievement. And so now, I urge the Senate to press home the advantage, match the domestic action with international action, in particular, deliver the billions of international climate finance being asked of Congress for the coming years. Finance, my friends, is a key ask of climate-vulnerable countries, and we must all, including the United States, deliver on our promises. Now, I want to now turn specifically to the role of the students in this room. Look, I know there is much talk of the midterms right now and of the partisan nature of climate policy at a federal level here. But in fact, because of this, I encourage you all to run towards the heart of the climate debate on both sides of the aisle, at national and subnational level. Now, of course, I know that many of you will be considering that 30-minute hop on the one train to Wall Street. Well, frankly, that work is going to be pretty pivotal too. All of the climate action that I've talked about today, all the promises that have been made, have one thing in common. It requires us to turn the billions currently flowing into climate finance into trillions. And so what we need is advocates like you in the boardrooms, on the trading floors, here in New York and around the world. And there are similarly catalytic roles in civil society, particularly recognizing climate justice is completely interlinked with economic and social justice for so many people around the world. And in all of this work, I'm actually really heartened to know that you will be joined by colleagues from the increasing number of climate and sustainability schools in the US and around the world, from the students who hosted me just up the coast at Tufts in March to those that I met last month at Canto University in the Mekong Delta of Vietnam. On Monday, I had the privilege of attending the state funeral of our late monarch, Her Majesty the Queen. And in a moment of quiet reflection in Westminster Abbey, I thought back to Her Majesty's words delivered to world leaders attending COP26. And she said, and I quote, "It It is the hope of many that the legacy of this summit, written in the history books yet to be printed, will describe you as the leaders who did not pass up the opportunity, and that you answered the call of those future generations. That history is still to be written. And I hope that the leaders of today, in my own country, here in the United States, and indeed across the world, will heed the late Queen's wise words. And to those of you setting out on your own leadership journeys, please make them count. Of course, whilst my former role ends at COP27, I will be there with you, continuing to champion the cause of climate action, which is so vital. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, President Sharma. It was fantastic to have you here. Amazing to hear your words. We've got a little bit of Q&A now, and I'm going to, in a few minutes, in 10 minutes, open it up to people in the audience to ask you questions. I'm particularly interested to hear from students, prioritize their voices. But I thought I'd kick off by asking you a bit more about this, where you see the biggest obstacles in terms of making progress with climate. There's tons of talk about climate, notwithstanding Ukraine, et cetera, and the importance of that, and the pandemic. Climate is, ramping up to be the thing everybody's talking about, and yet the action seems to be so much disconnected from that. So what you've described in your words was a phenomenal amount of progress being made under your leadership, which I think is very encouraging. But there must be some really big chunks of stuff that you wish you could move forward faster. So I was wondering if you could just tell us about what do you see as the biggest chunks of stuff that need to be, where progress really needs to be made to, and is it just coal, or is it something more specific in terms of engagement?
So, I think in terms of progress, I mean, yes, right now, global geopolitics looks pretty dark. But actually, if you look at this over a period of time, what has happened, as I described, we are moving that temperature curve downwards in terms of commitments. The year in which economies peak their emissions is moving closer. And in fact, there are some very big emitters who have a public statement on which year they will peak in, where actually the reality is they will probably peak earlier. So I think we have to look at this from a sort of perspective that work is going on, and we have to be sort of hopeful about that. But for me, I think there are the big issue here is going to be around finance. Actually, how do you mobilize all of that money? And I don't think we can ever say to any developing nation, curb your growth, because we, as developed nations, have been using up the carbon budget. You can't do that. That is morally wrong. What you can do is support them with their clean energy transition. And I talked about Vietnam, where we are pulling together support internationally to support them with their clean energy transition. They want to do it, but they need our support. They need support in terms of technology, in terms of finance, and particularly money from the private sector. So, if you were saying to me, what is the one big area that I want to see which will drive things forward, it is the money. And in Glasgow, we had Mark Carney, who I know has also spoken here. Mark pulled together the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Basically, financial institutions responsible for $130 trillion of assets, 40% of all financial assets in the world, committing to go to net zero by 2050. But the reality is, if you speak to somebody in a developing nation, their question is, show me the money. Show me the money. Where are the trillions? And so making sure that you are translating those commitments to actually money flowing is going to be absolutely vital.
And President Bollinger talked about the fact that we built this climate school, which is up and running. We're trying to go in as fast as possible, get things going in record time. And it's been immensely successful and wonderful to see the students engage. But from the point of view of where you see universities in the whole of this, what do you think are the really important things that learned institutions like Columbia, Cambridge, wherever in the world, where do you think do you think they should be upping their game in some way, or changing and recognizing the crisis and changing the way they're doing things? Are there ways in which you think we should be doing more?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we spoke about this earlier, Alex, is that, you know, Columbia is obviously part of a grouping of universities internationally that are focused on tackling the issue of climate change and working together. But again, I'm sort of a former investment banker, so sort of I think a little bit through a sort of private sector lens on a lot of things. But when I talk to businesses, you know, they are absolutely on this page now. And I actually think we have moved past that inflection point where businesses, governments and civil society are effectively singing from the same hymn sheet. The business community get this. They get this because their clients and customers want them to go in this direction, but also because it is actually good for the bottom line. They get that. And so, you know, there are all these reports that are written, statistics, which tell you that actually if you do things in the right way, you're going to create millions of new green jobs, value-added jobs, high-paid jobs. And then the business community says, that's great, that's what we want. But who's going to train these people up? And that's why I think this continuing partnership between you know, brilliant universities like Columbia and the business community is so important, to make sure that it is the right courses, it is the right training, so people are able to move into you know, a green space within the private sector.
Yes, and as you say, I think, you know, we need to do this globally, and we have to find ways to educate and train people in all parts of the world in climate, the younger generation. I was wondering if you could say something, last question before we open it up. Could you say something about the way students, who very often feel, I think, quite, from our experiences here, feel quite disconnected from COP, which is partly because of the physical distance and you can't easily get there and all the rest of it, and the fact that COP is sort of overloaded. How can they actually get engaged with what's going on in COP? Are there particular ways you think that our students or other students could get more involved?
So we were very keen going into COP26 that it had to be as inclusive a process as possible. And Archie Young, who's my chief negotiator, who's sitting here at the front, a brilliant man, you know, we sort of said, right, how do we get civil society and youth groups involved? And so we set up a civil society and youth advisory group right from the start. And I can tell you, when we set this up, that first meeting, people were really pretty skeptical, because they thought, you know, are we effectively going to be used as a mechanism to say you're engaging, but you're not actually really engaging? I hope by the time we got to the end of COP26, the civil society groups felt and youth groups felt that we had engaged. And so what do I mean by that? First is actually listening to their concerns and making sure that what they were saying, their asks, were reflected in the language that we wanted to negotiate, the work we were doing on issues like climate finance, access to finance, and also making sure that we had as many youth and civil society representatives coming to Glasgow as we could. Of course, you know, we sometimes forget this, but we organized this event in the shadow of COVID. And right up until 2 weeks before COP26, we were being told by all sorts of people, cancel it. This is going to be a disaster. You're going to get tens of thousands of people from around the world coming across. Everyone's going to catch COVID. This is not going to work. Actually, we persevered. We had the right protocols in place, and the incidence of COVID was way lower within the conference than it was outside in the general population. But what we were also keen to do was that civil society and youth groups were able to, obviously physically where it was possible to be in the room, but we also set up a virtual forum so they could literally see what was going on in terms of negotiations. And the team had sort of regular dialogues with those groups throughout that 2-week period. So as the negotiations developed, they were able to provide their input as well. So, I mean, I don't know how many of you were at COP26? Okay, great. Well, what I would say to you is that, you know, if you want to go to future COPs, get involved with the youth groups and see whether you can find yourself a ticket there, because it is an amazing thing, and you will meet lots of people. And I think what we'll hopefully have in every future COP going forward is a big business contingent as well, where you see that interaction between the negotiations and effectively the sort of the real world economy as well. And by the way, I just make one more point before we go to the sort of full Q&A, which is that each of us has a voice. And I know sometimes people think, you know, I'm just one person, what difference can I make? Well, you have a voice and you have a collective voice. And you can push governments locally, nationally, you can push businesses to actually do a lot more. And that's what we need to see, even more of that coming forward from civil society.
Great, thank you very much indeed. So we've got some mics set up. I think that's probably the way we're going to do the Q&A. So if people want to ask questions, please stand up and grab a mic.
Hi, President Sharma. My name's Scott Solomon. I'm a Columbia Mathematics alumnus, and I was a banker. If you design a global wealth tax on the 0.7% of the wealthy corporations and foundations in a way where the taxed are only owe 1/3 the tax amount if they pay with bank loans, so a guy with net assets of $1 billion would only have to pay $120 million if he doesn't pay with a loan, but he only owes $40 million if he pays with a loan. Then all these guys would pay with loans, and this would be the most lucrative event in the entire history of banking. There would be two by like 10 orders of magnitude. The two flows of funds would be the loan fees on the basically risk-free loans, so that would be risk-free revenues to the banks, and the second would be the securitization fees as the banks securitize the risk-free loans. This tax design is called the Woodford tax, after Michael Woodford. Other than the creation of the climate school, President Bollinger's one of his greatest achievements was recruiting the economist Michael Woodford from Princeton to Columbia. This tax could raise $25 trillion a year to deploy toward climate change, and I was wondering what you would think of such a strategy for getting the funds. As you said, that's the most important thing.
Okay, we got about 15 people wanting questions, so
Okay.
keep them short if we could.
Do you want to do a number of questions at one go, or
We could do. Do you want to ask?
or entirely up to you?
Let's get a second question
Yeah.
from over here. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Mr. President, for joining us today. You mentioned in your speech that trust is perhaps the most important factor in negotiations. So I want to know, what is your advice from spending time both in the private sector and also serving the public? How do we go about building that trust? Is it purely just through reputation, or is there anything that we could do as young people to start building that trust for our future careers? Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Great question. So I think firstly on the issue of tax, look, my sort of personal view on this is that at the end of the day, if you're going to tax institutions, I mean that's certainly sort of one approach. What I'm sort of very keen on is that what we make sure is that money is actually genuinely flowing into technologies in countries where it will make a difference. For me, doing a just energy transition partnership is actually what will make a real difference, because what you're going to be doing is setting up the right frameworks in individual countries, both in terms of their regulatory environment, but also in terms of technology, so there is investment actually flowing because they can see a return on this. And ultimately, all of this money, sort of, which is within the private sector, ultimately is the money that people put in through their pension funds, etc. So I want to make sure that what we do is enabling mechanisms to allow the private sector to invest. And by the way, I agree with you, it's going to need trillions. It's going to need trillions. And that money is there, and there's a willingness to invest, but we just need to make sure that the conditions are right in the countries that we need this money to be deployed to. The issue of trust is absolutely key. And I think the way that certainly we built the trust in these climate negotiations was my team, we literally went round the world. and we met people, we developed relationships, and so that, in those final moments when, you're presenting a revised text to someone, and you say to them, this is a text, this is the best that we can do, and we've got to make sure that we deliver this deal. That is the point where people will look you in the eye and say, yeah, actually, I think that's right, because you have built the trust with me. And I think what can young people do? I mean, I think this goes back to the point about, we talk about sort of, money. I mean, how do you spend, your dollars? What sort of jobs are you going to go into? And I think that, making that clear to politicians, but also making it clear to businesses, I think is the way that I think young people can make a real difference.
Another question over here. If we can keep the questions short, because there's a lot of people wanting to ask questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Sharma, for your time. My name is Isabel. I'm a student at Barnard studying economics, political economy, and human rights, and I'll be working in financial services consulting after graduation. And I also do a lot of work with activism surrounding the prevention of the spread of preventable disease through specifically Africa dealing with malaria. And we saw, activists like myself saw the United Nations pledge upwards of $14 billion to the Global Fund, which is incredible. And so I wanted to ask this question on behalf of myself and the rest of my team at the One campaign. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. And it's that, where do you want to see the youth focus their activism so that we can keep upping those numbers? Because it's crucial. Lives depend on it, obviously. So.
Yeah. Okay, maybe I'll take one more.
Yeah. Let's go away.
Thank you so much, President Sharma, for being here and letting us hear you speak. I'm Shayan Chaudhary. I'm an undergrad at Columbia, just started 3 weeks ago. I wanted to ask you a question on climate migration, and this was something I got the chance to speak with John Kerry about a few days ago, actually. So you mentioned the situation in Pakistan, where there's 33 million people that are currently displaced, also in a situation in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Fiona, and recently there's been some estimates of somewhere around 200 million to 1.2 billion people being displaced by climate activities and events around the world. And having myself worked in a refugee camp in Bangladesh, it's heartbreaking to see the different conditions that these people live in, and they don't really have much opportunity to have much social mobility or escape the situation that they're in. So what are some of the biggest challenges in tackling this monumental problem of climate migration and climate refugees, and what are some actual mitigation strategies that we can work on, especially as youths? Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. Actually, before I answer those questions, can I just ask my colleague Alex Irwin to take a bow? So Alex, get up for a minute. Go on, get up. Alex is one of your alumnus. He was here last year. He works with me and he helped me put together the speech that I've just given. So, I mean, given you said you were here for 3 weeks, I thought I should introduce Alex. Just on the... So modest, so modest. Just on the two issues. So Isabel raised this issue of the Global Fund, the amount of money that's been raised, and actually what more can young people do? And then I think we also had this great question on climate migration. And actually, those two questions are linked, because if you have a look at the impact of climate change, absolutely, it exacerbates existing risks that we already have in place. So whether that is migration risk, whether that is food insecurity, whether that is the risk of war, all of that is exacerbated by a changing climate. So there is a complete interlinkage in all of these areas. And if you, I'm sure the university here will have done sort of research on this. There are organizations like sort of Chatham House in the UK, which have done a lot of research on what they describe as cascading risks. And so what we need to make sure is that when we talk about climate, we don't look at this in some sort of solo, but when we make the case for climate action, we also make the case that if you are able to tackle climate change, this is also going to help in terms of all of those other insecurities and risks that you have. And again, what can sort of young people do? Well, I mean, keep pushing. Keep pushing. You know, one of the things that if any of you come to future COPs, and those of you who've been, know that there is effectively civil society and youth have an opportunity to protest. We had that at the pre-COP in Milan, and people were pretty vocal. We had that at COP26, and I think actually that's right and proper. And in any kind of democratic civil society, that right to protest needs to be really jealously guarded. And so, you know, be out there, make the case for what you want to see in terms of climate action.
Another question over here.
Hi, my name is Imani Fong, and I'm a second year here at Columbia. So I was really inspired by what you said about mobilizing money and the power that the private sector can have, especially as someone who spent the last summer interning in ESG and corporate sustainability. But I was also very interested about how we can mobilize this money towards loss and damage legislation. I know Scotland recently made the effort this year to devote funding specifically towards addressing the inequities caused by climate change, but we've seen a lot of pushback from other developed countries about this. And so I was wondering if you think that we will see more countries taking the step that Scotland has taken, and why we are seeing some of that resistance towards it.
Great.
Should we
Great
take
question. Yeah,
another question over here?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Sharma, for such an inspiring talk. My name is Alan. I'm currently a graduate student at the engineering school and working part-time at the climate school as a research assistant focusing on data science with the Grid 3 project. So my question is quite simply, even if we move very quickly, even if there is a large influx of funds coming from either the public sector or the private sector, how do we measure and evaluate that the money is well spent, that the projects and initiatives that we fund are not just 100 one-offs, but one cohesive and sustainable effort? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Two really, really good questions. So the issue of loss and damage, you'll sort of all understand this, is a big issue for very many developing nations. And I think at COP27, this will be one of those sort of big items that features very, very heavily. You know, I've been doing this for 3 years now, and even in that time, I have seen the mood music change. So some developed countries starting to become much more forward-leaning in the way that they're approaching this particular issue. And what we did manage to do in Glasgow was to get an agreement on the Glasgow dialogue. And basically, we agreed a 4-year program where there would be a discussion with the end result being, you know, how do we deal with this issue of loss and damage? Right? This is all, I mean, you know, one of the things that you learn in these climate negotiations is you can't force anyone to do anything. You have to build the consensus. And so there will have to be a consensus that emerges on this issue of loss and damage. But I do think, you know, in Glasgow, we managed to move this forward as part of the discussion. And we'll see, you know, where this goes. But it's also worth pointing out that, you know, there is, one of the things we agreed in Glasgow was doubling the amount of money for adaptation finance that developed economies would provide to developing nations by 2025. We managed to make progress on something called the Santiago Network, providing technical support for countries who are suffering from loss and damage. And then, of course, the big play is, again, I keep going back to this, if you want to really make a difference, this is going to take trillions of dollars, and that has to come from the private sector. I think Alan asked this issue of, you know, how do we know whether the money is well spent? Well, obviously the public money, so when the UK government, for instance, spends overseas development aid, there are independent reports produced which you know, tell us how individual projects have gone, whether they're value for money, and that'll happen across the world as well. But if you're going to deploy trillions of dollars from the private sector, well, you can be pretty sure that your shareholders will then decide whether you're doing this properly or not. And I just want to make one other point on since I think, Alan, you're saying you were sort of data science and sort of that part of the world in terms of your academic background. One of the things that we launched in Glasgow was called the Glasgow Breakthroughs, and we've looked at 5 sectors which represent around 50% of global emissions, and we are working with the private sector, with governments, to see how we can accelerate technology to deliver lower emissions in those sectors by 2030, but to do it in a way that is affordable for all countries around the world. And that's how we're going to make a difference as well. There's a lot of technology out there. We just need to make sure that it is deployable and it is affordable to people across developing nations as well.
That's great. Right, let's have another question over here.
Hello, thank you, President Sharma, for being here with us today. My name is Sarah. I'm a journalist here at Columbia, and I wanted to start with sort of a journalistic question. I actually had the honor of covering you when you met with President Suga in Tokyo, just last year actually. And my journalistic question was sort of what efforts on behalf of COP are being made to sort of stop disinformation regarding the climate crisis? And just sort of as a side question as well, what is something you weren't able to achieve during your presidency that you hope your predecessor will be able to achieve? Thank you.
Great, thank you for that. So, I mean, disinformation is an issue, and in fact, leading up to COP26, we did a lot of work also talking with the platforms that support social media, and trying to make sure that disinformation was not coming to the fore. But I mean, this is an issue, and believe it or not, there are still people across the world who are skeptical about the science. And I would just point out, and you should make this point if you come across people who are skeptical about the science, is that we have these IPCC reports that come out at regular intervals, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are really very detailed reports on the science of climate change around the world. And ultimately, they are agreed by the countries that are part of this process. So the last IPCC report was agreed by 195 governments, right? That is a consensus view. And I think making sure that we are making that point in all the discourse we have is really vitally important. What didn't we achieve? Well, I mean, look, there's lots of things that I think we want to see happen over the next few years. And I just want to make this point is that, this is a process. And sometimes we think, this COP was a success, this COP wasn't a success. But actually, even the COPs where people have felt, well, they didn't achieve everything, they actually did make progress, because that dialogue continued, and that led into the next COP, which then perhaps delivered what was trying to be achieved at the previous COP. So this is a process, and I hope COP27, which is dubbed an implementation COP, will build on what we got over the line in the negotiation at COP26. So we will make progress on lots of these work programs as we go forward. So I'm sure Archie can give you a list of all the things he wants to see achieved at COP27, but it is a process.
Another question over here.
Mr. Sharma, thank you for coming here. My name is João Adrien. I'm a master's student in environmental science and policy, and I follow the negotiations since the Paris Agreement, focus on agriculture and climate change agenda. Looking forward to the COP27, I would like to see your impressions of the main deliveries of challenge of this COP, especially in 2 points. First is the global carbon marker, the Article 6, which is a very important issue of the negotiations. And the second point is the adaptation agenda. We talked a lot about mitigation, but adaptation is a very important issue, especially for developing countries. I would like to know your opinion regarding that. And last but not least, I would like to acknowledge your effort to put everyone together in the Glasgow Agreement. I was in the Ministry of Agriculture. I have the opportunity to receive you on Brazil, and I can acknowledge your effort to listen to different countries, ensuring that this process leaves no one behind. Thank you very much, and congrats for your efforts.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me take those 2 questions. I think, firstly, in terms of global carbon market. So, one of the things we actually closed off the Paris Rule Book, as it's called. You will all know in 2015 we had this historic agreement, the Paris Agreement, that countries signed up to. but what it did do was to leave some of the detailed rules for future COPs to negotiate. And I think after 6 years, people were getting pretty fed up that we still hadn't closed off some of the most difficult negotiating items. One of those was on voluntary carbon markets on Article 6. We did manage to close that off. And so what has been happening in this year is the details, technical work, having reached agreement on what we want Article 6 to actually look like. The detailed technical work has been ongoing to make sure we then operationalize it. So we'll see whether we're able to set that out in COP27. I'd certainly like that to happen. The issue of adaptation you've raised is really vitally important. This COP is going to take place in Africa. Africa is responsible for 3% of global emissions. 3% of global emissions. And yet, some of the most climate vulnerable countries are found on the African continent. And therefore, it's absolutely right that we have a big focus on adaptation. I think what we got over the line in Glasgow was actually a pretty balanced outcome across the pillars of the Paris Agreement in terms of mitigation and finance and adaptation. But absolutely, we need to make sure that we are doing even more on adaptation. So one of the things from a finance perspective we will be doing is putting out an update on this $100 billion plan. And the German and Canadian governments are working on that. And I hope that will demonstrate progress on adaptation finance. And the other issue is the global goal on adaptation, where we agreed a work program, and again, that is moving forward. So you're absolutely right. I think adaptation will be the other big issue, together with finance and loss and damage, which will feature very heavily at COP27. Thank you.
Okay, I'm afraid we're running out of time. We've got time for one last question.
Hi, President Sharma. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. My name is Mary. I just graduated from Columbia in the engineering school. I have a few questions that are very together, but basically, you mentioned in your speech that there are certain participants in COP agreements that don't necessarily comply with what they agreed with during COP. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on gaining greater compliance with agreements like the Glasgow Pact? And how do you envision creating a system of accountability in the private sector for COP participants?
Yeah, those are great questions. Okay, so firstly, I mean, the reference I made was to the G20. The G20 is responsible for 80% of global emissions. And therefore, for me, it is absolutely incumbent that they show leadership and they take things forward. And what we did see in Indonesia at the G20 meetings was some rowing back on the commitments that had already been made. Now, part of this, frankly, people attributed to the fact that the chances of getting a agreed consensus text was going to be very challenging anyway, because there is not a shared view on Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And therefore, if we weren't going to get a consensus text, then why make such a big effort on some of these areas? I think what we need to ensure is keep saying to governments that we need to work on these issues together. The reason that it worked at COP26 is because every country understood it was in their collective self-interest to deliver on climate change. I went around the world. I've been to now about 50 countries around the world, many of them 2 or 3 times, 4 times, some of them. And actually everywhere I went, and you spoke to ministers and businesses and civil society, they all recognized the impact of climate change in a negative way in their own country. And therefore there was that collective interest. And so what we need to do is rekindle that spirit of cooperation going into COP27. We've got a pre-COP in Kinshasa, and I hope that will provide the opportunity. And I think it's really important that as people go into COP27, they go with that spirit of cooperation and hope and willingness to work together. I think that is actually still possible, but we need to work very hard at that. And in terms of the issue of accountability of the private sector, yeah, look, I mean, I've said this to business leaders here in New York, is that it's one thing to make commitments about what you might achieve in 2050. The other is actually demonstrating how you will do it, and what you will do in the short term. So what I have said is that, if you're a big corporate and you're setting out this commitment to 2050, well, tell us, what will you do by 2025? What will you do by 2030? Let's see those transition plans. And I think this is a role, again, for sort of shareholders as well, to push corporates to do more. And there is some skepticism out there about, greenwashing and, is all this stuff for real? And one of the things that the UN Secretary General announced at COP last year was an expert group to look at all of these commitments that are being made by the private sector, and sift through those and come to a conclusion on what is actually which of these commitments have got integrity. Now that work is ongoing, and I suspect we will hear more about that particular expert panel at COP27 as well. So I think it's vital that both countries and corporates deliver on the commitments that they've made. Thank you.
I'm afraid we have to wrap this up, but I'd like to thank everybody here, particularly the young people, for asking questions, students. But I'd also like to say that universities like Columbia are all about training future leaders, and it's been fantastic to see the example of you and your leadership in terms of helping to take the world forward in this immeasurable task of moving the dial on climate change. It's also been great to hear some of the positivity you bring to it, which I think is actually sometimes we get lost, and it's been inspiring to hear you talk about this. So please join me in thanking very much President Alok Sharma for his contribution.